Our guest today was the editor-in-chief of RE Generation Quarterly for 5 years. He is now an executive editor at Christianity Today. He serves on various boards. He studied classics at Cornell University and received an MDiv from Boston University School of Theology. He's also the author of Culture Making, Recovering Our Creative Calling, and most recently, Playing God, Redeeming the Gift of Power. So we're delighted to welcome Andy Crouch. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's great to be here.
Now, your most recent book is about power, and I want to get right into it and ask you the question that you say in the book you have been asked most frequently, and it's on page 44. Many people have confronted you with Lord Acton's quote, "Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely." You reject that,
Yes.
but you say it does have resonance. Can you explain?
Well, it clearly resonates because when you tell people you're working on this topic of power, you hear that phrase almost every time.
Right.
We all know it. It's become part of our kind of common lexicon. And it reflects a very real human suspicion of power and people who have power. And of course, especially people who end up with dramatic amounts of power. Even though I can absolutely prove to you in a moment that Lord Acton was not, that what he said was false or was incomplete. Because there was a time in your life, my life, and the life of every person who will watch this interview where someone had pretty much absolute power over them but was not absolutely corrupted by it. Mm-hmm. And that's when we were all infants, when we were babies. Mm-hmm. When we were babies, our parents had as close to absolute power as any human being has over another human being in many ways. And yet, our parents were not, on the whole, corrupted by it. Now, that doesn't mean they were perfect parents, but they were not absolutely corrupt parents, or we would not be sitting here having this conversation. Right. So right away, we can realize, well, there's something about love, at least, that when it's introduced, even into a relationship of, at least for the moment, very asymmetrical power between a parent and a child, does not corrupt the relationship. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a clue to a new way of thinking about power, which is that there are some kinds of power that are not necessarily corrupting and, in fact, are essential for flourishing. That we actually have to use, as a parent, I have to use my power in my child's life, or else my child does not become everything they were meant to become. Mm-hmm.
So love, in that sense, is the, if you will, the antidote to a misuse of power.
Yeah.
Although it's also the case that in some of those situations, there are whole social constructs that say it's inappropriate to misuse power for children, against children, and that sort of thing as well.
So we have not just maybe the impulse of love that connects me to this little person I have power over, but then we also have restraining structures of culture and expectations and limits and boundaries. And power absolutely requires those. And that's because being a human being actually requires limits and boundaries to flourish. This is part of the kind of remarkable layers of wisdom in the idea that the first human beings flourished in a garden. A garden is a bounded environment. And you actually put human beings in a limitless, boundless environment like a wilderness, and we don't flourish unless we have backing us up those structures of culture. So power, like everything in human life, has to have limits to be used well. But when it's properly limited, it actually is of the very essence of what it is to be a flourishing human being.
Now, so love can certainly place boundaries on this or be the antidote to a misuse of it. And then there are external boundaries. Would you advocate internal boundaries? I mean, would you say, I probably shouldn't have this degree of power because I will misuse it? I mean, do you advocate that for people? They say, I just don't think I should be the leader of that organization because I don't know that I can handle that.
Right. That's a tricky thing. And I'm often asked, another thing people ask is, well, should Christians seek power?
Yeah.
And I think if you take the biblical commission for human beings to be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, have dominion over the creatures of the earth, that in a way, I'm not sure it's an option for a human being made in the image of God not to at least receive the gift of power when it's given.
But that's slightly different, right?
Slightly different from ambitiously just going and grabbing all I can get. But here's what I think has to happen. I have to become the kind of person who can actually be entrusted with the level of power I'm being offered. And that requires exactly this formation of and maintenance of an inner life that is strong enough to resist the distortions of power, which are basically idolatry and injustice. And the way that happens in the Christian tradition is through what we call the spiritual disciplines. So you think about the big three spiritual disciplines: solitude, silence, and fasting. That seem to come up over and over again in the tradition when people want to talk about what forms you into a kind of a full human being. When I'm alone, when I'm in solitude, I am withdrawn from all those social networks that give me kind of a sense of agency and authority. When I'm silent, I'm withdrawing from that human impulse to speak into the world and command in the world. I'm just being silent before my Maker. And when I fast, I'm limiting my intake of food, so I feel physically weak. And if I don't have those disciplines, those humbling disciplines, as a regular part of my life, I can't be trusted with any amount of power. But if you deeply enough shape your life according to those disciplines, I think the biblical witness would be you can, in fact, be granted a great deal of power and not misuse it. And when, at the end of 40 days of solitude, silence, and fasting, the tempter comes and says, here's my vision for your life, you can say, that's not my vision. Not because you're giving up power, but because you're not going to take a false form of power.
Yeah. No, that's a really helpful way of thinking through what kinds of disciplines are required. I guess I still wonder, does that answer the question about seeking it, though? Because in that example, you're saying now you're prepared to receive it. And that's one thing. But most of the time, in order to gain power, we have to go after it and grab it. To some degree, it seems that way. You know, that's the way we think of moving forward in life. Those are even maybe the metaphors we use.
There are two problems that human beings have to solve as they mature, and I think it depends on which kind of person you are. And one problem is too much agency. That is too much sense of myself as being able to act. And the Christian life for the person with too much agency, this would be Peter. Peter in the Gospels is the disciple who always has something to say. Usually it's not the appropriate thing to say. He often has to be rebuked. Like, he has a total vision for how Jesus' trip to Jerusalem is going to go. And Jesus says, get behind me, Satan. You are not even thinking about this in the way God would think about it. So Peter, tremendous sense of agency, needs to be humbled and needs to discover how limited his actual intrinsic power is, how much in need of grace he is, and so forth. The other side, though, is that there's another human condition, which is not enough agency. Not enough sense that I'm made in the image of God. I'm made to take on, Paul says we're going to reign with Christ. That's a lot of power. So which you need depends on which kind of person you are. Now, if you are let's say a 30 or 40-something-year-old male who is of European descent in American culture with a college education, which would happen to apply to both of us, I'm guessing you have a very well-developed sense of agency. And the gospel for you and for me will be about taming that and humbling that and not grasping it. On the other hand, if you are, just to turn all the tables, let's say a young woman in an African slum in one of the cities of Africa, who everything around you tells you are of no value, then you actually, I would say, growth for you is going to be acquiring agency. And will actually not be about learning how to humble yourself unduly, but actually how to seek the appropriate authority that is yours by right as an image bearer of God. So the prescription might be different for different people.
And perhaps some of the spiritual disciplines you talked about would be helpful in diagnosing that.
Yeah, this is, well, actually, the fascinating thing about the spiritual disciplines is they're both diagnosis and prescription.
Right.
When I undertake solitude, I quickly discover all my fantasies of power, as well as all my fears, perhaps of powerlessness. And I'm invited to bring those before God. When I'm silent, I start hearing those inner voices that actually have nothing to do with the voice of the Spirit or anything I'm supposed to be preoccupied with. When I fast, for one thing, I discover how many convenience stores there are in my neighborhood, which otherwise I just wouldn't realize. Oh my gosh, there's so many places to buy food.
I had no idea I liked potato chips that much.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I never go to McDonald's. I suddenly discover every McDonald's in the vicinity and think, wow, French fries. Oh, that'd be awesome. But more deeply, I discover how impatient I easily become, how inattentive I usually am. So they're diagnostic and they're the cure. It's such an odd thing. They both reveal the disease and cure the disease at the same time.
You talk in the book about how Christians are uncomfortable just using the word power. And so there are all these euphemisms, influence, leadership, that are getting at the same thing, but not actually embracing that term. Do you think that's true in the broader culture as well, or is that a Christian problem probably because of our awareness of our own sin, our awareness of the fall, or the reality of that?
Yeah, I would say it's especially a Christian temptation to, when we talk about power, to only want to talk about the good side, which sort of potentially could get us off the hook of being accountable for the dangers of the influence, authority, servant leadership that we wield. Those words make it sound like anything you're doing is for good.
Right.
Whereas in fact, even influence, authority, and even servant leadership in the wrong hands can be misused.
Right.
In the wider culture, though, we are in an interesting transition from what anthropologists sometimes call a high power distance culture to a low power distance culture. So it used to be that even American culture was relatively comfortable with distinctions of rank. So the CEO has a big office and drives a certain kind of car and wears a certain kind of clothing. Well, now, in some of our most influential companies like Facebook, the CEO wears a hoodie, and he's 28. Right. And he has tremendous power, but he does not want to look like he has power. So I actually think our culture happens to be in a moment where it's shifting to this sort of low power distance mentality, which is we try to pretend we don't have it. Even when you're the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company, you will act like you don't have it. So I think the temptation is there, both in the Christian community and outside, to pretend it's not as real and as big as it is. But Christians have an amazing ability to spiritualize and sort of shuffle off the more challenging implications of what it means to have power in the Christian community.
Well, it strikes me, too, that even in those cases you mentioned, Viv, that Zuckerberg wears a hoodie, I'm sure there are many, many times when he feels very comfortable wielding power. There are just certain symbols and certain ways that he feels like it's probably not beneficial for him to do that, or he doesn't want to for whatever reason. But I'm sure when it comes to big decisions about the IPO, he wants the last word.
He exercises power.
Yeah.
And this is the interesting thing. High power distance cultures look like there's more power because you can see it, but in fact there's the same amount no matter what. It's just a preference as to whether we display it or not.
Right.
And it's very easy, by the way, if you're a low power distance kind of person, to judge a high power distance context and say, oh, those military dictators in certain countries who wear, row after row of little signals of their power. Yeah. We would never do that in America. Our president wears a suit. Well, our president is just as powerful in his own way often. Yeah. It's just that we prefer a different way of displaying it, but the underlying dynamics don't change, actually.
Yeah. And I think that's a really interesting observation, that whether you're in Downton Abbey or whether you're, a senator today or whatever, I mean, there probably actually is much greater similarity than we care to believe.
Than we would care to believe.
Yeah.
And we look at Downton Abbey with its rigid distinction of upstairs and downstairs and class and so forth. But the reason we relate to it is, in fact, those distinctions exist at every bus stop, in every supermarket, in our own homes, and it's foolish to pretend they're not there. And the question is, what are we doing with these unequal amounts of power? I mean, the reality is power is unequal in every human community. And I don't think that has to be an entirely bad thing, but it sure is a bad thing if the people who possess most of the power use it to protect their own interests and just to preserve their privilege. Then it is a real danger, and it is corrupting then.
Now, the other thing that struck me as I tried to think this through in terms of the story of the Bible is that it seems to me that while power can be a gift, and you say that's the thesis of my book, power is a gift, or can be a gift, but at the same time, it does seem that there are striking examples in the Scriptures where God actually works in an unbelievable way through someone who is really powerless.
Right, seemingly powerless.
Seemingly powerless.
Yes.
And I'm not even just thinking of the incarnation, but I'm thinking, David is the son who's out in the field. He gets chosen. Again and again, the rule of primogeniture is undermined in Genesis.
Right.
So that then the question I have is, should we be sort of expecting the world to work that way? Or it seems like what you're arguing is, power is here. We should use it in love and receive it as a gift. You know what I'm saying? There is that tension because God will often upend those things unexpectedly.
Absolutely. Power, the true power that is meant to be given to human beings, that leads to the flourishing of the world and other human beings, it is a function of image bearing. It is not a function of privilege or status or rank or position. It's a function of being an image bearer of God. And this means that true power can break out in history anywhere. And maybe especially at the margins, because part of the redemptive story of Scripture is rescuing us from our imagination of what false power is. And we have a false imagination of what power is. Namely, you have to hold a certain position, have a certain rank in order to get anything done. That is not true in God's economy. God can use the Hebrews in Egypt. God can use David out tending the flock. God can use Gideon hiding in the winepress. I mean, God absolutely, in order to rectify this false picture we have, chooses the smallest things and the weakest things to put to shame the apparently biggest and strongest. However, all that being said, the danger is that those of us who really through no fault of our own and no, whatever the complement of that is, just without trying, we've ended up with privilege. That's the reality of being an American. That's the reality of being a man. We could tick off all the sources of power and privilege. That's the reality of having a college degree. The danger would be that we would somehow try to minimize the reality of what we have because we're aware that there's nothing intrinsic about being a man or having a college degree that gives me access to God's power. I would rather we just be honest about it and say, I have it, I probably have more of it than I can handle, and so I desperately need relationships with the relatively powerless. I desperately need partnerships with the poor. I desperately need to become poor in spirit myself in order to handle the hand I've been dealt, which happens to be a reasonably substantial amount of power. I'd rather that we be honest, because the flip side is God does not spirit the Israelites or the Hebrews out of Egypt without warning. He engages Pharaoh. Pharaoh, the most powerful person in Egypt, has the opportunity to participate or not with God's purposes. Jesus is brought before Pilate. Paul is brought before Felix and Festus. Paul has this sense of calling to Rome, to the center of power, because the gospel is ultimately meant to transform not just the margins, but the whole story, including those who end up, for better or for worse, at the center.
And in fact, that's what happened in church history. Is it wasn't simply a marginal movement from a certain social class. It seems to probably have affected
even at the very
all
beginning.
Yeah,
it seems, Paul writes to the Philippians and he says, hey, by the way, the members of Caesar's household greet you as well. So very early on, there was this, and then we have this amazing letter, the letter to Philemon. Here's this paterfamilias, Philemon, in whose home a church meets. It must be a big home, big house, mega McMansion type house. And yet Paul sends Onesimus, the slave, back and says, now you're going to be brothers. You're going to have paterfamiliases and escaped slaves as brothers in this family. So clearly, from the beginning, the purpose was not that it just be a marginal movement, nor just an elite movement, but something that in some mysterious, amazing way knit together across those differences, the image bearers, who are all ultimately just image bearers in God's family.
And uses both of their advantages and experiences for the growth of the gospel.
And when you look at beneficial social change, even in recent history, it's amazing how often it is a partnership between the apparently marginal, who always have more power than we realize, and the seemingly elite. So the civil rights movement in the United States is led on the one hand by a Southern African-American preacher, Martin Luther King Jr., but essential and crucial to the success of the civil rights movement is a Texan president, Lyndon Baines Johnson. And LBJ and MLK worked together to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It's both elites and people at the margins. The end of apartheid is absolutely Nelson Mandela, imprisoned for most of his adult life on Robben Island. But it's also F.W. de Klerk, the Afrikaner president, who says it's time to end this system. It's amazing how often beneficial social change is a partnership between elites and the marginalized.
No, that's really helpful. Those are really helpful examples. Now, I'm thinking about both of your books, the Culture Making book and the Power book, and I'm thinking those seem to have originated with you saying something's wrong. We've got something just a little bit off. And a lot of times it seems to me it's the way we're talking about it seems to reflect a deep uneasiness or a deep uncertainty about how we should interact with culture or how we should interact with power. So now what I'm wondering is, what are you observing that you're saying?
What's the next?
What's the next? What's the next?
Well, I know what the next one is. I'm not sure I'm going to write a book about it for a number of reasons. But a big next one is sexuality.
Okay.
And when you think about culture and power, part of the problem we have in the Christian community is we've inherited thin ways of thinking about these things. And we are now in a great contest in Western culture to understand the meaning of human sexuality, the value of human sexuality. And the church has, on the one hand, I believe, the richest possible tradition on which to build a healthy picture of human sexuality. But in practice, just as we have a healthy set of resources for culture and power, but in practice, our language for and our ways of framing sexuality are very thin. I don't know that anyone wants to read me writing a book on sex. I don't know, and so I'm not volunteering, but I do think that's one of the big next things.
Andy Crouch, thank you very much.
Absolutely a pleasure. Thank you, Jonathan.
All right. You know what?